After the divorce, I was humiliated and thrown out of the house by my former mother-in-law. 1 week later, I discovered that I was pregnant, but I decided to hide my pregnancy from my ex-husband and his family and planned to give birth alone. When I went into labor and was about to deliver at a hospital near my place, my ex-husband suddenly walked into the room as the doctor assigned to handle my case. 10 minutes later, something happened that changed everything. Before the story begins, please write in the comments which region you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so the Stories with Meaning channel can continue to grow and bring you even more powerful stories. The sound of a solid oak door slamming shut echoed throughout the elite residential complex. Catherine flinched, but forced herself to stand tall on the cold marble terrace. In front of her stood Mrs. Reynolds, her former mother-in-law, her face flushed red as she struggled to contain her exploding rage. Her trembling index finger pointed straight at Catherine's face. Behind Mrs. Reynolds stood Victor, frozen in place. Catherine's ex-husband kept his head down, unable, perhaps unwilling, to look at the woman he had officially divorced just 1 hour earlier at the family court of Chicago. A light drizzle began to fall that afternoon, as if nature itself mourned the heartbreak unfolding on the porch of the Reynolds family's grand mansion. Mrs. Reynolds stepped forward aggressively, forcing Catherine to retreat a step. She grabbed Catherine's large black suitcase and hurled it down the marble steps without hesitation. The suitcase rolled violently before landing on the wet stone pavement below. The sound of its wheels scraping against the ground felt hollow and lonely, just like Catherine's heart. Mrs. Reynolds shouted loudly, deliberately raising her voice so the neighbors could hear. She screamed that the house was pure and unworthy of being stepped on by a woman who brought bad luck. Insults poured relentlessly from her mouth. She called Catherine useless, nothing more than a freeloader who lived off her son's wealth for 5 years without producing any results. Catherine took a deep breath, fighting back the tears threatening to spill. She adjusted her long shawl, which had been pulled earlier when Mrs. Reynolds shoved her shoulder. She knew crying would only give the woman satisfaction. When the judge's gavel struck earlier that day, Catherine had promised herself she would never shed another tear for this family. She looked at Victor, silently hoping he would defend her just once, but her hope died instantly. Victor remained silent. The man standing before her was no longer the Victor she once knew, but a shadow controlled entirely by her mother's ambition. Mrs. Reynolds shouted again, ordering Catherine to leave immediately. She said she couldn't see the face of a daughter-in-law she believed to be infertile. That accusation had haunted Catherine for 3 years. Doctors had confirmed both of them were healthy. It just wasn't time yet. But for Mrs. Reynolds, the absence of a grandchild was an unforgivable sin. Her obsession with grandchildren wasn't driven by love, but by a condition in the late Mr. Reynolds' inheritance, rumored to be tied to the birth of the first grandchild. Catherine slowly walked down the steps towards her suitcase as the rain grew heavier, soaking her clothes. Her dress and shawl were stained with rain and dirt, but she didn't care. She straightened her back and turned to face Mrs. Reynolds and Victor one last time. Calm but piercing, she said, "Today, I leave this house in humiliation, but remember this moment well. I will never return. I will never ask for your help, not even if one day you kneel before me." Her cold gaze finally made Victor flinch, but Catherine had already turned away. Dragging her suitcase, she walked through the heavy rain, passing the tall iron gate that had imprisoned her misery for years. Her steps felt heavy along the wet sidewalks of Chicago. She had no destination. Her wallet held only a small amount of cash. During the marriage, her finances had been controlled entirely by Mrs. Reynolds under the pretense of saving. Back then, she had obeyed blindly. Now she realized how foolish she had been to surrender control of her life. Luxury cars sped past, splashing dirty water onto her, completing the cruelty of the afternoon. Yet, strangely, she felt relieved. The burden on her shoulders washed away with the rain. She was free. No more daily insults, no more condescending stares at the dinner table, no more unreasonable demands. After walking nearly 2 kilometers, she found a quiet bus stop and sat there, shivering. She pulled out her phone and searched for a cheap short-term rental. She found one located in a narrow alley far from the elite district. Without hesitation, she booked a rideshare. The journey felt endless. Skyscrapers gradually gave way to cramped residential buildings. She arrived at a modest 2-story boarding house with peeling paint. The elderly landlady greeted her kindly, her eyes filled with pity at her soaked appearance. She paid 1 week's rent using the last of her US dollars. The room was small, barely 3 by 3 meters. The mattress was thin and dampness clung to the walls. But to Catherine, it was a palace compared to the luxurious hell she had left behind. This place offered peace. She opened her wet suitcase, pulling out clothes and hanging them to dry. As her hand reached the bottom, it touched a hard, rectangular object. She frowned. She didn't remember packing anything like that. She pulled it out. It was an old, leather-bound Quran belonging to the late Mr. Reynolds, her father-in-law, who had passed away 2 years ago. Catherine remembered how kind he had been to her, the only one who had ever defended her against Mrs. Reynolds' verbal attacks. Perhaps without realizing it, she had placed the Quran into her personal bag while cleaning his room long ago, and it had ended up in the suitcase. She opened the holy book carefully, hoping to calm her heart. But as she turned to the middle pages, a small black notebook slipped out and landed softly on her lap. The notebook was thin, more like a pocket journal. Catherine picked it up, curiosity flickering in her eyes. On the first page, written in neat cursive handwriting, was the name Arthur Reynolds. She flipped through the pages slowly. The contents were confusing. It wasn't a diary. Instead, it was filled with strings of random numbers, location coordinates, and fragmented phrases that didn't form complete sentences. One page was circled heavily in red ink. On it was a long sequence of numbers resembling a bank account, but the number of digits didn't match any standard format. Below it was a single warning sentence. "The key belongs only to the mother of my first grandchild." Catherine froze. She knew Mr. Reynolds had been a highly successful businessman with vast assets. Yet after his death, Mrs. Reynolds constantly complained that the inheritance was far smaller than expected and that the family business was struggling. Could there be hidden assets? Catherine closed the notebook, her heart pounding. This was no ordinary notebook. It was a clue, but she was too exhausted to think further. She slipped it beneath her pillow and lay down, hoping that morning sunlight would bring her a brighter tomorrow. A week passed since Catherine left the Reynolds household. Life in the cramped boarding room slowly began to feel normal. Every morning she woke before dawn, prayed, then prepared herself to look for work. Catherine held a degree in business management with strong academic results, but a 5-year gap in employment made competing difficult. Still, she refused to give up. She took freelance work as an online article writer and document translator to survive. The money wasn't much, just enough for simple meals and the next week's rent. But she was grateful. At least she was living off her own efforts, not money laced with humiliation. That morning, Catherine woke up feeling deeply unwell. Her head spun violently as if the room were rotating around her. Her stomach churned painfully. She rushed to the shared bathroom at the end of the narrow hallway. The nausea peaked, and she vomited, only clear liquid since she hadn't eaten yet. Her body felt weak. She sank onto the cold bathroom floor, clutching her stomach. At first, she assumed it was just fatigue or catching a chill from the rain days earlier. Then, realization struck her. Her monthly cycle was late. Amid the stress of divorce and survival, she had forgotten to count the days. She was 10 days overdue. Her heart raced. No, that's impossible, she thought desperately. For 5 years of marriage and countless fertility programs, there had been nothing. Why now? Why after the marriage had already fallen apart? With trembling hands, Catherine splashed water on her face. She dressed neatly and walked to the nearest pharmacy. She bought the most accurate pregnancy test available, hiding it inside her dress pocket as if it were contraband. On the way back, her mind was a battlefield, hope and fear clashing violently in her chest. Back in her room, she took the test immediately. 3 minutes felt like 3 centuries. She placed the test stick on the edge of the small sink and turned away. Sitting on the bed, she clasped her hands tightly, praying nonstop. If it was negative, she would be heartbroken. Her maternal instinct had always longed for a child. But if it was positive, she didn't know how she would face it alone. Finally, she gathered her courage. She picked up the white stick. Her eyes widened. 2 bold red lines. Positive. Catherine covered her mouth as sobs burst free. Her body slid down onto the floor. She was pregnant. The child she and Victor had waited for all these years arrived only after their marriage was completely destroyed. Joy surged through her chest. She gently stroked her still flat stomach. There was life there. Her blood. Her flesh. But then, the cruel face of Mrs. Reynolds flashed in her mind, turning joy into terror. Catherine remembered her obsession with grandchildren tied to inheritance. If Mrs. Reynolds discovered the pregnancy, she would do anything to seize the baby. She had money, she had power. She could win custody, or worse, she could hurt Catherine just to claim the child at birth. Catherine stood up quickly and wiped her tears. A mother's protective instinct ignited within her. She could not be weak. No one from the Reynolds family could know. Not even Victor. He was too weak and would inevitably tell his mother. Catherine decided to hide her pregnancy completely. She would fight alone. Still, she knew she needed someone trustworthy, especially for legal protection and safety. Her mind returned to the mysterious notebook. One name surfaced: Leonard, her childhood friend, now a rising young attorney. They had been close before Catherine married, before Mrs. Reynolds forbade her from interacting with male friends. Catherine searched for Leonard on social media and nervously sent a message. He replied quickly, without judgment, without hesitation. They agreed to meet at a small cafe hidden far from the social circles of Mrs. Reynolds. That afternoon, Catherine met Leonard. He looked sharp in his tailored suit, but his eyes were as warm as she remembered. She told him everything: the expulsion, the secret pregnancy, her fear of Mrs. Reynolds. Leonard listened intently. His expression hardened with restrained anger as he heard about the Reynolds family's cruelty. He promised to help Catherine legally and protect her future custody rights. He advised her to stop merely surviving and start planning. Then Catherine pulled out the small black notebook and placed it on the table. She explained how she had found it. Leonard, intrigued by puzzles and investigations, examined it carefully. He flipped through the pages, studying the numbers and coordinates. His eyes narrowed at the red-circled page. He opened his laptop and typed the number sequence into a secured banking database he had access to as a corporate attorney. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. His face turned serious. Leonard rotated the laptop toward Catherine. On the screen was information about a high-security private vault at an elite private bank. Leonard explained that the numbers were dual access codes for a top-tier safe deposit box. The vault was registered under Arthur Reynolds' name, but its status was frozen under special conditions. The condition matched the warning in the notebook. The vault could only be accessed by the legal guardian of Mr. Reynolds' first biological grandchild, supported by valid DNA test results. Leonard stared at Catherine intently and said that the child growing inside her was not an ordinary baby. That unborn child was the single key to unlocking a hidden fortune, an asset whose value might far exceed all the wealth currently controlled by Mrs. Reynolds. Catherine gasped. She never imagined that Mr. Reynolds had prepared such a scenario in advance. Perhaps he had already foreseen his wife's greed and betrayal. That realization made Catherine's position far more dangerous. If Mrs. Reynolds discovered the existence of the hidden assets and the condition required to unlock them, then Catherine's life, along with her baby's, would truly be hanging by a thread. Mrs. Reynolds would do anything to obtain the baby as the living key to the vault, then erase Catherine from existence forever. Leonard reached across the table and firmly clasped Catherine's hand, grounding her. From this moment on, he said, they were a team. He would protect this secret with his life. Catherine was told to focus solely on her pregnancy and her health. Leonard would handle further investigations into the assets and prepare a solid legal safety net. They agreed to keep the pregnancy secret until the very last moment, until the baby was born and strong enough to become undeniable living proof. That vow of silence bound them together beneath the looming threat of a storm that could strike at any moment. 4 months had passed since the night Catherine was thrown out. The seasons had changed, but the cold gripping her heart had not eased. Physical changes were now undeniable. Her once flat stomach had begun to round, a clear sign of the growing life inside her. Catherine stood in front of the cracked old mirror in the corner of her boarding room. She examined herself wearing a dark brown long dress, 2 sizes larger than her actual body. A long shawl draped down, carefully covering her chest and stomach. The disguise was essential. She could not allow anyone to notice the changes in her body, especially those who might recognize her and report her whereabouts to Mrs. Reynolds. Catherine's life had become drastically secluded. She minimized interaction with the outside world. Whenever she had to leave for groceries or part-time work, she wore a medical mask and oversized glasses. She deliberately chose quiet hours, before sunrise or late at night, to avoid crowds. Fear constantly followed her, as if Mrs. Reynolds' eyes were watching from every corner of the city. Yet, beneath that fear, a new strength grew. Every time she felt the subtle movement of the baby inside her, Catherine's resolve burned brighter. She was fighting for 2 lives now. That day was her scheduled monthly prenatal checkup. Until now, Catherine had moved between small clinics far from the city center to avoid leaving traces. But this time, she felt concerning pain in her lower back. The doctor at the small clinic recommended a more thorough examination at a major hospital equipped with advanced ultrasound technology. With great reluctance and deep anxiety, Catherine decided to go to Medica Prime Hospital, the largest hospital in Chicago, the very place where Victor worked as an obstetric specialist. It was an extremely dangerous decision, like walking into a lion's den. But for her baby's health, Catherine pushed aside her fear. The hospital was massive, with hundreds of staff. The chance of encountering Victor was small if she stayed cautious. She arrived at the hospital walking quickly, head lowered, pulling her medical mask high to cover most of her face. She registered as a general patient, using only her last name to avoid attention. The obstetrics waiting area was crowded that afternoon. Catherine chose the farthest corner seat, partially hidden behind a large pillar. Her heart raced every time a white lab coat passed by. She scanned her surroundings relentlessly. Thankfully, the doctor who examined her was not Victor, but a kind senior female physician. The examination went smoothly. The baby was healthy, but Catherine was advised to rest more and avoid stress. The problem arose when she had to collect her prenatal vitamins from the hospital pharmacy. The line was long and winding. Catherine stood anxiously, glancing repeatedly at her watch. She wanted to leave as quickly as possible. Suddenly, from the main lobby entrance, the sharp sound of high heels striking the tiled floor echoed. The sound was unmistakable, familiar. Catherine turned slightly and her blood ran cold. There she was, Mrs. Reynolds. She walked arrogantly, dressed in bold designer clothing, sunglasses perched atop her head, a luxury handbag swinging proudly from her arm. She was not alone. She was dragging Victor behind her, who looked exhausted and defeated. Panic surged through Catherine. She was trapped in the line and couldn't flee. An elderly person stood ahead, moving slowly. The distance between them closed rapidly. Mrs. Reynolds appeared to be scolding Victor loudly in public, unconcerned with the stares around them. Catherine caught fragments of her complaints about recurring headaches from stress over failing businesses and how she had forced Victor to accompany her to pick up medication. The path to the VIP pharmacy counter passed directly by the general patient line where Catherine stood. Catherine turned her back, pretending to search inside her bag. Cold sweat dripped down her temples. Mrs. Reynolds' footsteps stopped directly behind her. Catherine held her breath. She heard Mrs. Reynolds speak in a suspicious tone. Perhaps she recognized the posture or the handbag, the same old bag Catherine used to carry when she was still a daughter-in-law. Mrs. Reynolds called out hesitantly but sharply, questioning the woman standing before her. Catherine closed her eyes, praying silently. If she turned around, it would be over. Mrs. Reynolds would notice the disguised curve of her stomach and recognize her eyes. Mrs. Reynolds' hand lifted, reaching towards Catherine's shoulder to force her to turn. Just 1 second before that hand touched her, a strong arm wrapped around Catherine's waist, pulling her close. A calm, baritone voice sounded beside her. A man stood next to Catherine, his arm around her shoulders, protective yet respectful. It was Leonard. Somehow, impossibly, he had appeared. Leonard greeted Catherine loudly with an affectionate nickname, deliberately ensuring Mrs. Reynolds could hear him. He pretended to be a husband who had just returned from the restroom, asking playfully why his wife was standing there alone. Mrs. Reynolds jolted in surprise and withdrew her hand. She stared at the scene in confusion. Before her stood a seemingly affectionate married couple, the tall, well-built man and the woman leaning into his arm. Her earlier suspicion began to waver. The woman's posture resembled Catherine's, yes, but Catherine couldn't possibly have remarried so quickly, and certainly not to a man as handsome and Leonard as Leonard. Besides, as far as Mrs. Reynolds knew, Catherine had never been allowed male friends. She herself had made sure of that. Mrs. Reynolds snorted in irritation, convinced she had mistaken the wrong person. Mrs. Reynolds scoffed sarcastically, muttering about people flirting inside a hospital, then roughly pulled Victor's arm and dragged him toward the VIP counter. Victor glanced back briefly at the couple. His eyes met Catherine's, partially hidden behind oversized glasses. Something strange rippled through him, a painful sense of familiarity, but he was too exhausted to process it. He turned away and followed his mother. Once Mrs. Reynolds and Victor disappeared around the corridor corner, Catherine's legs gave out. She would have collapsed if Leonard hadn't caught her in time. Leonard quickly guided her through a back exit leading to the parking area. Inside the safety of the car, Catherine finally broke down and cried in relief. Through sobs, she asked how Leonard had known she was there. Leonard explained that he had assigned someone to discreetly watch over her for security reasons, and the moment he learned she had gone to the hospital where Victor worked, his instinct screamed danger, so he rushed there immediately. Leonard gently scolded Catherine for taking such a massive risk. Catherine apologized, realizing how her recklessness could have destroyed everything. That day became a harsh warning for both of them. Mrs. Reynolds was a real and present threat, one that could appear at any time. This Cold War was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Time moved forward mercilessly. Catherine's pregnancy entered its 7th month. Her belly had grown significantly, impossible to hide with loose clothing alone. At close range, the baby's movements were obvious, frequent kicks as if impatient to enter the world. Catherine now spent most of her time inside her small boarding room. She had stopped taking part-time jobs that required her to leave the house. Her living expenses were fully supported by her emergency savings and Leonard's help, money he insisted on lending as a debt to be repaid later once the inheritance was released. At first, Catherine refused, but for her baby's nutrition and safety, she swallowed her pride. Across the city, the atmosphere at the Reynolds family estate had grown dark and oppressive. The property and agricultural businesses left by Mr. Reynolds were rapidly declining under Mrs. Reynolds' control. Her greed and uncontrollable luxury lifestyle shattered the company's cash flow. Investors began pulling out, losing confidence in her arrogant leadership. Bills piled up. Debt collectors from banks called the house constantly. Mrs. Reynolds grew increasingly vicious. She blamed everyone for the collapse, except herself. Every day, the grand mansion echoed with her angry screams, cursing household staff or berating Victor for being useless and incapable of fixing the family's finances. That afternoon, Leonard visited Catherine at her boarding room with crucial news. The young attorney's face was serious, but there was a glint of victory in his eyes. He carried a thick folder containing documents from a 3-month-long investigation. Leonard sat on the floor on top of the thin carpet and opened the folder. He explained his findings regarding Mr. Reynolds' original will. It turns out Mr. Reynolds had created a secret clause stored with a trusted private notary, not one easily bribed by Mrs. Reynolds. The contents were shocking. Mr. Reynolds explicitly stated that the controlling shares of the company in liquid assets worth tens of millions of US dollars would not go to his wife, Rika. Instead, those assets were frozen inside a trust fund. The release condition was precise: the birth of the first biological grandson from the male bloodline, Victor's child. If no grandson was born within 5 years of Mr. Reynolds' death, the entire trust would be donated to a Western social foundation, while Rika would receive only the residence and a strictly limited monthly allowance. Leonard explains that this was the real reason Mrs. Reynolds had relentlessly pressured Catherine to get pregnant. And once Catherine was deemed a failure, she was discarded without hesitation in search of another woman. Mrs. Reynolds never wanted a grandson to love. She needed a living vault key. The truth sent chills through Catherine's body. The baby in her womb was no longer just a child. It was a target worth millions. If Mrs. Reynolds discovered the pregnancy, she would use any means, legal or illegal, to seize the baby at birth, then eliminate Catherine and claim the assets as the child's guardian. Catherine hugged her belly tightly, silently vowing that Mrs. Reynolds' filthy hands would never touch her child, not even for a second. Leonard reassured her. He had prepared airtight legal protection. The moment the baby was born, they would immediately conduct a DNA test and file the inheritance claim in the child's name, with Catherine as the sole legal guardian, completely cutting off Mrs. Reynolds' access. Meanwhile, in the luxurious house that now felt like hell, Victor was searching through old insurance documents in the storage attic under his mother's orders. Mrs. Reynolds shouted from downstairs, demanding he quickly finds any insurance policies that could be cashed out to cover short-term debts. Victor dug through dusty cardboard boxes, his heart hollow. His thoughts drifted to Catherine. Since that brief encounter at the hospital 3 months ago, the image of his ex-wife had haunted him relentlessly. Guilt gnawed at him for not defending her when she was thrown out. He realized he was nothing more than his mother's puppet, a coward without principles. As he shifted a box filled with old, unused items, his hand brushed against a woman's handbag in the corner. It was Catherine's bag, left behind during the expulsion. Mrs. Reynolds must have ordered a maid to dump it in storage instead of returning it. Victor picked it up, brushing off the dust. Pain stabbed his chest, holding something that once belonged to the woman he loved. He opens the bag, hoping to find something, anything, to keep as a memory. Inside were only old shopping receipts, a broken lipstick, and used tissues. but in a hidden inner pocket, his fingers touched something smooth. He pulled it out. An ultrasound photo. A blurry black and white image showing a tiny fetus, still just a small cluster. Victor's heart stopped. He was an obstetrician. He knew exactly how to read an ultrasound. The fetal size indicated a pregnancy of approximately 6 weeks. His hands shook when he checked the date printed on the corner. Part of it was torn and smeared with melted lipstick ink, the year and month unreadable. Victor collapsed onto the dirty attic floor. His mind raced, calculating frantically. If this ultrasound was taken shortly before the divorce, then Catherine had been pregnant when she was thrown out. He tried to remember. Weeks before the divorce, Catherine complained of dizziness and feeling unwell, but Mrs. Reynolds always accused her of being lazy or pretending to be sick. Victor clenched his hair in frustration. Had he driven his own flesh and blood? Was the baby still alive? Or did Catherine terminate the pregnancy out of hatred toward Victor? Or worse, had she miscarried due to the trauma and stress of being expelled? Terrifying questions swirled through Victor's mind. His curiosity morphed into sheer panic. He replayed his memory of that brief encounter at the hospital, the woman who looked so much like Catherine. She had been wearing loose clothing. Her walk had been different, careful, heavy, the unmistakable gait of a pregnant woman carrying extra weight. The puzzle pieces began to click together in Victor's head. If Catherine was truly pregnant, then the child was his. His child, the child he had secretly longed for all this time. Suddenly, the storage room door flew open with a violent slam. Mrs. Reynolds stood there, her face flushed with rage, shouting at Victor for taking too long. Instinctively, Victor shoved the ultrasound photo into his trouser pocket. He looked at his mother, really looked at her. This time, there was something new in his eyes, suspicion, and a spark of anger that had never dared to surface before. Victor stood up. He made a decision. Without his mother's knowledge, he would uncover the truth himself. He had to find Catherine. That night, the sky seemed determined to unleash all its fury upon the earth. Lightning tore through the darkness again and again, slicing the sky with blinding white flashes, followed by thunder so violent it rattled the window panes. Rain poured down mercilessly, turning the streets of Chicago into murky rivers. Inside the Reynolds family mansion, the atmosphere was no less stormy. The grand living room had been transformed into a formal reception space. Mrs. Reynolds, dressed in a striking maroon silk gown, barked orders at the staff as they arranged an extravagant dinner. Tonight was decisive. She had invited the family of a wealthy business associate, one with an only daughter, hoping to arrange a marriage for Victor. A fresh injection of capital was her last chance to save the dying company. Victor stood in the corner of the room, trapped in a stiff formal shirt that felt like it was choking him. His face was pale, his eyes sunken from days of sleeplessness. Since discovering the mysterious ultrasound photo in the storage room, his mind had known no peace. Guilt haunted him, questions tormented him. He had tried, quietly, secretly, to locate Catherine, but she had vanished as if swallowed by the earth. No digital trace, her phone number was dead. Even old acquaintances claimed to know nothing. Tonight, amid his mother's insane matchmaking scheme, the disgust inside Victor finally reached its breaking point. He watched his mother laugh falsely into her phone, and for the first time in his life, a powerful urge to rebel surged through him. Then, fate handed him an opening. The honored guests called to say they were stuck in severe traffic caused by flooding across several areas of the city. Victor didn't hesitate. Without asking permission, he grabbed his car keys and the doctor's coat draped over a chair. Mrs. Reynolds noticed immediately and screamed at him to stop. Her eyes burned with a sharp, threatening glare, warning him not to step outside. Victor ignored her. He lied calmly, without emotion, claiming there was an emergency call from the hospital involving a patient's life. Before Mrs. Reynolds could physically restrain him, Victor was already running through the rain toward the garage, speeding away from the mansion that felt more like a prison than a home. He needed air. And ironically, the hospital emergency department, filled with blood and cries, was the only place where he felt like a useful human being. Meanwhile, in a cramped boarding room on the flood-prone outskirts of the city, Catherine was fighting alone against waves of pain. Her pregnancy had reached week 38, and since the afternoon, her belly had been tightening at increasingly shorter intervals. At first, she thought it was false labor, but when warm fluid soaked her nightgown, she knew her water had broken. Panic crept into her mind. Outside, the rain fell brutally hard. Thunder roared, amplifying the terror. Suddenly, the electricity went out, plunging the entire area into darkness. Catherine was left alone, illuminated only by occasional lightning flashing through the ventilation slits. She fumbled blindly for her phone and tried calling Leonard. No signal. The message she sent spun endlessly without being delivered. The pain intensified. She groaned, clutching her stomach. Slowly, she crawled toward the door, pounding weakly on the wooden surface, screaming for help with what little strength she had left. By sheer luck, the thunder paused just long enough for her cries to be heard by her neighbor next door, a middle-aged woman who owned a small food stall, Mrs. Taylor. The door was forced open. Mrs. Taylor froze in shock at the sight of Catherine, collapsed on the floor, drenched in sweat, amniotic fluid pooling beneath her. She shouted for her husband and other residents. Chaos erupted. They all knew Catherine had to get to a hospital immediately, but the alley outside was already flooded knee-deep. Ride-hailing cars and ambulances couldn't reach them in time. The only vehicle capable of pushing through the flood was an old open-bed pickup truck owned by Mr. Taylor, usually used to transport vegetables. Without hesitation, the neighbors worked together to lift Catherine onto the back of the truck. A blue plastic tarp was stretched over her to shield her from the pounding rain. Catherine lay on a thin mattress, soaked and shivering, biting her lip until it bled as contractions struck every 2 minutes. The journey was hell. The old truck lurched violently over potholes hidden under the floodwater. Catherine clutched Mrs. Taylor's hand, squeezing it hard each time pain ripped through her womb. Her consciousness faded in and out. She whispered prayers for her baby's safety, begging the child to hold on just a little longer. Mr. Taylor drove as fast as he dared towards the nearest fully equipped medical facility. Fate was cruel. The closest hospital on that route was Medica Prime Hospital, the very hospital where Victor worked. Half conscious, Catherine had no strength to protest. All she wanted was for her baby to live, even if it meant walking straight into the lion's den. The pickup screeched into the emergency entrance. Mr. Taylor jumped down, shouting for help. Nurses and security rushed forward, wheeling a stretcher toward the truck. Catherine's soaked, shivering body was lifted onto it. Fresh blood was visible between her legs, mixed with rainwater and amniotic fluid. She was critical. A triage nurse quickly checked the fetal heartbeat. It was dangerously weak. The red emergency alert was activated. The stretcher was rushed down the cold hospital corridor, wheels screeching against the floor. A nurse shouted urgently into the radio, calling for the on-duty obstetrics specialist to report to the delivery room immediately. Obstructed labor with fetal distress. That night, in the middle of a raging storm, fate brought together two souls who had long been forced onto separate paths, under the most dramatic circumstances imaginable. Victor had just finished suturing the wounds of a traffic accident victim in the emergency department when an urgent announcement echoed through the hospital's internal speaker system. The call was specifically for him. Other obstetric specialists were trapped by flooding and unable to reach the hospital. A senior nurse rushed toward him, her face tense, reporting that an emergency referral patient had just arrived, a woman in active labor with full cervical dilation, yet the baby was not descending, accompanied by alarming signs of fetal distress. Victor instantly cast aside his exhaustion. Adrenaline surged through his body, activating the professional mode that had long served as his refuge from the chaos of his personal life. He ran toward the delivery room, scrubbed his hands swiftly and meticulously, then slipped into a surgical gown and latex gloves. The automatic doors hissed open. Victor stepped inside with the composed authority of a doctor ready to save lives. The room buzzed with activity. Nurses and midwives were attaching IV lines and fetal heart monitors. The machine emitted rapid beeping, an ominous rhythm signaling fetal tachycardia. Victor moved to the operating table. The female patient lay weakly, her face covered by a clear oxygen mask fogged with condensation. Her hair was tightly wrapped in a wet, disheveled shawl. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her brow deeply furrowed as she endured unbearable pain. Victor quickly reviewed the medical chart handed to him, then leaned forward to assess her condition. Just as he was about to examine the birth canal, a violent contraction struck. The patient's eyes flew open. Her hand shot up reflexively and clutched the sleeve of Victor's gown with shocking strength. Their eyes met. In that instant, time stopped for Victor. The noise of monitors and shouted instructions vanished, replaced by a loud ringing in his ears. Those light brown eyes, wet with tears. That sharp gaze carrying both deep wounds and fierce strength. He knew those eyes better than he knew himself. They were Catherine's. Victor froze. His body trembled so violently that the nurse beside him noticed the sudden change. He stared at the face behind the oxygen mask in disbelief. Catherine, the woman he had been searching for, the woman his mother had expelled, accusing her of infertility. Now she lay before him, fighting to bring a child into the world. The truth struck him like a brutal blow. The swollen belly beneath the green hospital sheet was undeniable proof of the lies his mother had fed him for years, and proof of his own cowardice as a husband. Catherine recognized him too. Her expression shifted from pain to fear and then quickly hardened into a cold, hostile glare. She tried to pull her hand away as if Victor's touch were poison, but she was too weak. She struggled to speak, her voice hoarse and broken behind the mask. Her whispered words shattered Victor's heart. She begged him not to let Mrs. Reynolds find out about the baby's existence. She said she would rather die than allow her child to be touched by the Reynolds family. That plea was no longer from a wife to her husband. It was a desperate request of a mother protecting her child from a predator. Victor swallowed hard. His throat burned. Tears pooled in his eyes, but he knew he could not fall apart, not now. Catherine's life and their babies, yes, their baby, they were in his hands. For the next hour, he had to be a doctor, not a broken man drowning in regret. Victor took a deep breath, forcing his hands to stop shaking. In a firm voice, trembling slightly with emotion, he ordered the medical team to prepare for a vacuum-assisted delivery. The mother's strength was gone. He leaned close and whispered a promise into Catherine's ear. He swore to God that he would save them both and that he would keep this secret. Catherine stared at him blankly. There was no trust in her eyes, only surrender because she had no other choice. The delivery was tense. The baby's heart rate dropped dangerously low at one point, plunging the room into suffocating silence. Victor worked with precision. Cold sweat soaked his forehead. He guided Catherine through each push between contractions, his encouragement sounding more like desperate prayers. After 20 minutes that felt like an eternity, a baby's cry shattered the storm-filled night. The cry was loud, strong, the sound of healthy lungs. Victor lifted the newborn boy, still red, blood-covered, high into the air. A surge of emotion exploded in his chest. His son, his flesh and blood, the long-awaited heir born through suffering and sacrifice. Victor placed the baby on Catherine's chest for early skin-to-skin contact. His hands trembled as he touched the baby's warm skin. He wanted to embrace them both, to beg forgiveness until his voice gave out. But the cold wall Catherine had built stopped him. She held her baby possessively, tears streaming onto the infant's cheeks. She kissed her son's forehead with boundless love. When she looked up at Victor, her gaze hardened again. Her voice was weak but piercing. She stated clearly that Victor was the biological father, but he was not the child's protector. She asked him to leave as soon as his medical duties were finished. The words struck Victor harder than any physical blow. As the nurses took the baby to be cleaned and weighed, Victor discreetly collected a sample of umbilical cord blood using a small vial hidden in his coat pocket. His instincts were screaming. He recalled his growing doubts about his own biological origins, sparked by a glaring blood type mismatch with Mrs. Reynolds. He intended to run a DNA test, not to confirm the baby was his, he was already certain, but to uncover another, deeper mystery surrounding his family. Victor stepped back, giving the nurses space to care for Catherine. He exited the delivery room on unsteady legs, ripping off his surgical mask. In the empty corridor, he leaned against the cold wall, slid down to the floor, and cried in silence. He cried for his son, born amid a storm, for the woman he had failed, and for himself, trapped in his mother's web of lies. Yet through his tears, a new resolve took shape. He touched the blood sample vial in his pocket. From this night on, he would no longer be a puppet. He would seek the truth, even if it destroyed the only family he had ever known. Outside, the storm raged on, as if bearing silent witness that nothing in their lives would ever be the same. Inside the delivery room, the atmosphere slowly calmed after the baby's first cry. The clock on the wall read 2:10 a.m. Catherine lay weak on the delivery bed, her body drenched in sweat from the struggle, but her eyes shone with overwhelming relief. On her chest lay a tiny newborn baby boy, freshly cleaned and wrapped in a warm, light blue swaddle. The baby's breathing was steady, rising and falling peacefully, so different from his mother's heart, which still raced with the remnants of tension. Victor stood in the corner of the room, slowly removing his medical gloves. His gaze was empty, fixed on the cold, tiled floor. He had just helped deliver his own child, yet he felt he had no right to step closer, not even to touch the baby's cheek again. Once his medical duty was done, an invisible but impenetrable wall stood between him and Catherine, a wall built from disappointment and the wounds of past betrayal. The fragile silence did not last long. Exactly 10 minutes after the umbilical cord was cut, a commotion erupted from the corridor outside. Rushed footsteps and angry shouting echoed closer. Victor looked up. A surge of dread seized him instantly. Before he could reach the door, the double doors of the delivery room were violently shoved open, slamming against the wall. Mrs. Reynolds stood in the doorway. Her breathing was heavy. Her hair, usually perfectly arranged, was slightly disheveled from the storm winds as she stepped out of her car. Her sharp eyes scanned the room wildly, hunting for the one thing that consumed her obsession. Her gaze locked onto the bundle in Catherine's arms. A flash of greed ignited in her eyes, instantly replacing the fatigue that had briefly shown. Mrs. Reynolds stormed inside without regard for sterility protocols, brushing past nurses who tried to stop her. She marched straight toward the delivery bed, her steps hard and commanding. She pointed at Catherine's face with a finger adorned by a large diamond ring, her shrill voice pierced through even the sound of rain outside. She demanded to know who the baby's father was. Deep down, she already suspected the answer, but she needed a verbal confession to legitimize her twisted plan. She mocked Catherine, sneering that the woman she had cast out as infertile had turned out to be a skilled actress. She accused Catherine of deliberately hiding the pregnancy to blackmail the Reynolds family later. Her insults poured relentlessly, calling the innocent baby a filthy bargaining chip. Victor felt his blood boil. He moved swiftly, placing himself between his mother and Catherine, becoming a living shield for his former wife and child. He shouted at his mother to be silent. His voice trembled with the rage he had suppressed for years. He declared that the baby was his flesh and blood, his legitimate son, and the biological grandson Mrs. Reynolds had always coveted. Victor's confession made Mrs. Reynolds light up, but not with a grandmother's joy, with the satisfaction of a businesswoman who had just won a massive deal. She let out a cold, sinister laugh that sounded horrifying in the sterile room. She said that if the child was truly Victor's, then the family's financial problems were solved tonight. She ordered Victor to take the baby from Catherine immediately. Mrs. Reynolds planned to take the child for a DNA test at once and register him as the sole heir to the late Mr. Reynolds' assets, of course with herself as the legal guardian, claiming Catherine was poor and unfit. She tried to push past Victor, reaching out to snatch the sleeping baby by force. Catherine clutched her baby tightly, turning her body away, trembling in fear. The nurses and midwives stood frozen, unsure how to react as they witnessed the family drama of the hospital's owning family. Victor grabbed Mrs. Reynolds' wrist firmly, stopping her from touching the child. A tense struggle ensued. Mrs. Reynolds thrashed and cursed Victor, calling him an ungrateful son who defended a worthless ex-wife instead of the mother who had raised him with sacrifice. The chaos escalated. The baby began to cry, disturbed by the shouting. Suddenly, the door opened again. This time not violently, but with firm authority. Leonard stepped inside, followed by 2 uniformed police officers and a middle-aged man carrying a leather briefcase. A senior notary, the trusted associate of the late Mr. Reynolds. Their presence instantly froze the room. Mrs. Reynolds turned pale at the sight of the police. She released Victor's wrist and tried to straighten herself, reclaiming her composure. In a sharp tone, she demanded what the meaning of bringing outsiders into her family's private affairs. Leonard stared her coldly, his gaze cutting deep. He raised a red document folder in his hand. Leonard formally introduced himself as Catherine's legal counsel and the special executor of Mr. Reynolds' will. He stepped forward, his voice calm yet intimidating. He announced that he was there to read 2 critical findings, facts that would permanently change everyone's fate in that room. Mrs. Reynolds scoffed, dismissing Leonard as an inexperienced lawyer bluffing beyond his depth. Leonard ignored her. He opened the folder and pulled out a laboratory report bearing the official letterhead of a renowned genetic forensic institute. Leonard explained that he and Victor had secretly worked together. The blood sample Victor provided after the birth had been merely the final formality. In reality, Leonard had already collected Victor's DNA days earlier from a toothbrush and hair left at the hospital and compared it with a sample taken from Mrs. Reynolds, obtained from a used drinking glass at a charity event the week before. Leonard read the first result, the paternity test. With 99.9% accuracy, the report confirmed that the baby boy born to Catherine was Victor's biological child. This meant the primary condition of Mr. Reynolds' will had been fulfilled. The first legitimate male grandchild had been born. The assets worth billions of US dollars locked away in trust now officially had an heir. Mrs. Reynolds' eyes gleamed with greed. She believed she had won. She assumed that as Victor's mother, she could still control the assets through him. She even cast a sly smile at Catherine, as if to say that Catherine had merely served as an incubator whose purpose was now fulfilled. But that smile vanished instantly. Leonard lifted the second sheet of paper. His expression hardened as he looked directly into Mrs. Reynolds' eyes. He stated that one more fact had emerged from the DNA comparison, a truth buried beneath 30 years of lies. Leonard read the result of the maternity test between Victor and Mrs. Reynolds. Negative. There was no genetic match whatsoever. Victor was not Mrs. Reynolds' biological son. She had never given birth to him. The room fell deathly silent, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out. Victor staggered backwards, crashing into a medical trolley with a loud clang. He stared at Leonard, then at his mother, disbelief written across his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Leonard continued his explanation. Cruel, but necessary. Further investigation conducted by his team, it was revealed that 30 years ago, Mrs. Reynolds was merely a caretaker employed by a distant relative of Mr. Reynolds. Victor's biological mother, the lawful wife of Mr. Reynolds, had died during childbirth at a remote clinic while they were on vacation. At the time, driven by ambition and a hunger for status, Mrs. Reynolds exploited the chaos. She manipulated the situation, assumed the role of mother to baby Victor, and gradually inserted herself into the life of the grieving widower. Eventually, she married him. The most horrifying truth was that Mrs. Reynolds deliberately severed all of Victor's access to his biological mother's family, ensuring the secret would never surface. Victor lived his entire life inside a lie, devoting himself to a woman who was, in truth, nothing more than a fortunate kidnapper. Mrs. Reynolds began to tremble violently. Her face, once flushed with rage, turned deathly pale. Cold sweat beaded across her forehead. She shook her head repeatedly, muttering that it was all a lie, vile slander, fabricated to destroy her. Yet her body betrayed her words. The terror in her eyes was the fear of a criminal caught red-handed. The police officers standing behind Leonard stepped forward, hands poised near their utility belts. The elderly notary merely nodded slowly, confirming that Mr. Reynolds's will indeed hinted at his suspicions regarding his wife's origins. That was why he had demanded a comprehensive DNA test as a condition for the inheritance to be released. Victor felt his world collapse. His identity, his childhood memories, the fear and reverence he had held for the woman he believed to be his mother, all shattered in seconds. The woman who had controlled his life, who had forced him to divorce the woman he loved, was nothing but a stranger. Worse, she was a monster who stole him from his real mother. Nausea churned in Victor's stomach. He stared at Mrs. Reynolds' hands, the hands that once struck him when he disobeyed, the hands he kissed every morning as an act of devotion. Those hands were filthy. His legs weakened, yet at the same time a primal rage surged within him, the fury of a child betrayed by the person he trusted most. That stormy night bore witness to the unveiling of the foulest mask in the history of their family. Mrs. Reynolds' reaction to the DNA results was utterly unexpected. Instead of surrendering or begging for mercy, she erupted into terrifying hysteria. The refined socialite facade she had worn for decades shattered, revealing a feral, desperate face beneath. She screamed, a piercing sound more like the howl of a trapped animal than a human voice. She accused Leonard of forging documents, accused Catherine of orchestrating a malicious conspiracy, and screamed that she was the honorable Mrs. Reynolds, untouchable by anyone. Madness burned in her wild eyes. In her spiraling panic, logic abandoned her. She fixated on the baby in Catherine's arms as her final lifeline. In her fractured mind, control over the child meant control over the inheritance. The fortune belonged to Mr. Reynolds's grandchild, and whoever held the child held the money. Ignoring the approaching police, Mrs. Reynolds lunged at the hospital bed with lightning speed. Her goal was singular: to seize the baby from Catherine, or failing that, ensure no one else could have the child. Her long, clawed nails shot forward, aimed at the innocent infant's face. Catherine screamed in terror, clutching her baby and squeezing her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. She couldn't flee, her body still paralyzed from childbirth. But the attack never landed. A powerful body slammed into Mrs. Reynolds from the side. Victor. For 30 years he had bowed in obedience. He had never dared to meet her gaze. He had answered every command with a submissive yes. Now he moved on pure protective instinct. Victor shoved Mrs. Reynolds with all his strength, sending her crashing backward onto the hard hospital floor. The impact echoed painfully. She groaned, clutching her lower back, staring at Victor in disbelief. The obedient child had just struck her. Victor stood in front of the hospital bed, breathing heavily, chest heaving. His face burned red as tears of rage streamed down his cheeks. He pointed at Mrs. Reynolds with a trembling finger. For the first time in his life, Victor spoke with his true voice, the commanding voice of a grown man who had endured enough. He shouted that she would never dare touch his child or his wife again. The word wife slipped from his lips naturally, a subconscious confession of where his heart truly belonged. Victor unleashed years of resentment. He called her a fraud, a kidnapper, a devil disguised as an angel. He recounted his suffering, how he had been separated from Catherine, how he had been forced to live like a puppet. All for the ambition of a woman who shared no blood with him. The police acted immediately. Before Mrs. Reynolds could rise and attack again, 2 officers restrained her arms behind her back. The sharp click of metal handcuffs echoed through the room, signaling the end of her reign. She thrashed and screamed, calling Victor's name, begging her son to save her. She played her final card, emotional manipulation. She sobbed, reminding him who fed him as a child, who paid for his medical school tuition, who cared for him when he was sick. She hoped the indoctrinated obedience still lingered. Victor stared at her coldly. There was no pity in his eyes, only a hollow darkness. He stepped closer, aligning his face with hers, now soaked in false tears. In a calm voice heard by everyone, Victor delivered his final verdict. He said the woman who raised him died in his memory that very moment. Mrs. Reynolds was not his mother. She was a kidnapper who stole his right to know his biological mother. He owed her no gratitude. It was she who owed him a life that could never be repaid, even if she rotted in prison for the rest of her days. Victor stepped back and signaled the police to take her away. As officers dragged Mrs. Reynolds out of the maternity ward, she screamed curses at everyone. Her voice faded down the hospital corridor, replaced once more by the sound of heavy rain beating against the windows. Her departure left the room heavy with silence. The notary gathered his documents with trembling hands, visibly shaken by the drama he had just witnessed. He excused himself, stating he would contact Leonard immediately to begin the legal process of transferring the assets to the rightful heir as soon as possible. Leonard nodded, then gently patted Victor's shoulder, offering silent support before stepping out to handle the detention paperwork at the police station, giving Catherine the privacy she needed. Now only the 3 of them remained in the room: Victor, Catherine, and their baby. Victor turned to face Catherine. His shoulders sagged, as if the weight of the world had just been placed upon them. He looked utterly broken, his hair disheveled, his eyes swollen. He stared at Catherine with overwhelming guilt. He didn't dare step closer. He felt filthy, foolish for having been an instrument of the cruelty inflicted upon her. Victor opened his mouth to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. What good were apologies after so much destruction? He knew he didn't deserve forgiveness. He had just lost his identity as a son, and he knew he had failed as a husband. Catherine looked at Victor from her hospital bed. The fear was gone, replaced by profound exhaustion and a faint trace of pity. She no longer saw him as the infuriating ex-husband, but as another victim of Mrs. Reynolds' cruelty. Catherine took a deep breath, adjusted the blanket around her baby, and spoke in a calm yet firm tone. She said she had seen what Victor did earlier. She thanked him for saving their child from that mad woman's hands. It was the only truly right thing Victor had done in the 5 years they were together. But Catherine quickly drew a boundary. She made it clear that his moment of heroism did not erase the wounds of the past, being thrown out in the rain, being accused of infertility, Victor's silence when her dignity was trampled. Those scars were permanent. Victor nodded weakly, accepting the verdict with his head lowered. Tears fell again, hitting the floor. He confessed all his failures. He admitted he had been a coward. He said he felt utterly alone now. No parents, no wife, and unworthy of being a father. Victor felt small, insignificant. He slowly backed towards the door, believing his presence would only taint Catherine's happiness with her baby. When his hand touched the doorknob, he turned one last time, gazing at his child from afar with a longing that cut deep into his soul. He whispered a farewell, then stepped out into the empty corridor, leaving behind the warmth of the maternity room for the cold reality of a life that had just fallen apart. Catherine stared at the closed door with mixed emotions. There was relief, the greatest threat in her life, Mrs. Reynolds, was gone, but there was also pain in witnessing the complete ruin of a man she once loved. Catherine lowered her gaze to her son's peaceful face, the baby's tiny fingers wrapped tightly around her index finger. Catherine smiled faintly as tears of gratitude rolled down her cheeks. She whispered to her child that starting today, their lives would change. No more fear, no more hiding. They were free. Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving only a gentle drizzle washing over the city, as if nature itself were cleansing the remnants of that night's evil to welcome a new dawn. The masks had shattered, and beyond the ruins, a brighter future began to rise for Catherine and the little heir. 1 month had passed since that night of chaos. Time seemed to move differently for Catherine. Where her days had once been filled with fear and psychological pressure under the roof of the Reynolds family, she now felt a peace she had never known. Morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of a minimalist house she had recently rented in a quiet, leafy neighborhood of Chicago, USA. The house was far more modest than the grand mansion she once shared with Victor, but it possessed something that place never had: warmth and freedom. On a soft fur rug, her 4-week-old baby boy slept soundly. His cheeks were plump and rosy, his breathing steady, as if he instinctively knew he was finally safe. Catherine watched her son with immeasurable gratitude. Every pain, humiliation, and bloody struggle she had endured was repaid each time she saw that peaceful sleeping smile. Her life had drastically changed after the truth was exposed at the hospital. With Leonard's swift and efficient legal action, her baby's status as the sole heir to Mr. Reynolds' estate was formally ratified by the court. All assets previously controlled and misused by Mrs. Reynolds were now in Catherine's guardianship until her son reached adulthood. Catherine was not obsessed with wealth. She took only what was necessary for a decent life and her child's future education. The rest was entrusted to professional asset management under strict oversight by Leonard, reinvested into legitimate businesses. Catherine was no longer a woman who could be thrown out at will. She held control. Yet the wealth never went to her head. She remained the same Catherine, simple, grounded, a woman in a shawl who preferred quiet moments reading scripture beside her baby rather than indulging in luxury. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. Catherine was startled. She wasn't expecting a delivery or a guest. Leonard always called before visiting. Cautiously, she peeked through the window curtain. Her heart fluttered when she recognized the figure standing at the iron gate. The man was thin, much thinner than the last time she saw him at the hospital. His clothes were dull, his shirt wrinkled as if never ironed, and his once nightly styled hair had grown long and messy. It was Victor, her former husband, now looking like a stranger who had lost all direction. Catherine hesitated before opening the door, but compassion and lingering memories pushed her forward. She stepped outside to meet him on the porch, not inviting him in, protecting the privacy and sanctity of her new home. Victor looked at Catherine with hollow eyes and dark circles under them. The light that once lived there was gone. Seeing Catherine standing strong before him, calm, fresh, and whole, made him feel even smaller. He tried to smile, but it came out as an awkward, pitiful grimace. Victor began speaking in a hoarse voice. He asked how Catherine and her child were doing. His voice trembled when he said the word child. Catherine replied briefly and flatly that they were fine. Very fine. Even that answer struck Victor hard. It made him realize that Catherine's happiness existed precisely because he was no longer beside her. Victor then spoke of his own ruin. He told Catherine he had resigned from the hospital where he worked. He couldn't endure the shame and whispers among colleagues about the scandal that his mother was a kidnapper. His reputation was destroyed, his mental state shattered upon realizing that his entire identity for 30 years had been built on a massive lie. Victor said he now lived in a cramped, rented room, ironically similar to where Catherine had once lived after being thrown out. His modest personal assets were gone, spent on legal fees in a desperate attempt to reduce Mrs. Reynolds' sentence. It was an action he himself did not fully understand why he did it. Perhaps it was because a sense of filial duty had been planted too deeply inside him. Or perhaps it was pity, seeing the woman who raised him now locked behind iron bars. Victor confessed that he felt unbearably lonely. In a single night, he had lost everything: parents, career, home, and dignity. He came that day with one final hope. Suddenly, Victor dropped to his knees at Catherine's feet, ignoring the dust on the porch floor that stained his pants. He cried uncontrollably, begging for forgiveness. Victor clutched the hem of Catherine's dress, pleading for a second chance. He promised he would change. He swore he would become a firm husband, one who would never allow anyone to hurt Catherine again. He begged to be allowed back into her life, to raise their child together. Victor said he would start everything from zero. He was willing to take any job, do anything as long as he could be near Catherine and their child. He confessed that he loved her and only now realized how precious she truly was after losing her. Victor's sobbing was heartbreaking. It was the sound of regret from a man who realized his mistakes far too late. He repeated the word sorry like a mantra, hoping it might somehow turn time back. Catherine looked down at the man kneeling before her without overflowing emotion. There was no anger, no hatred, but there was also no love. Only pity, like looking at a gravely wounded stranger by the side of the road. Catherine slowly pulled her dress from Victor's grasp and asked him to stand. She didn't want a dramatic scene in front of her home. After Victor stood, his face soaked with tears, Catherine took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was calm and gentle, yet every word carried a sharpness more painful than shouting. Catherine said she had already forgiven Victor. She forgave his inability to protect her in the past. She forgave his silence when she was humiliated. But forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and certainly did not mean accepting him back. She explained that a glass once shattered, even if glued back together, would never hold water perfectly again. The wounds Victor inflicted were too deep. When Catherine was thrown out of the house in the rain, when she was starving, terrified, and alone protecting her unborn child, that was when her love for Victor slowly died, buried along with her tears. Catherine said that the man standing before her now was nothing more than the biological father of her child, nothing more. She did not need a husband who only discovered responsibility after the storm had passed. Catherine and her son had proven they could survive and live better without Victor's presence. Those words were a death sentence to Victor's remaining hope. He bowed his head deeply, his shoulders shaking as his sobs grew heavier. He understood now. The door to Catherine's heart was tightly shut, locked by the trauma he himself created. Then, Catherine reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a thick white envelope. She handed it to Victor. Victor accepted it with trembling hands, confused. He asked what was inside. Catherine told him to open it. Inside was a one-way plane ticket to the Netherlands, a substantial amount of cash in US dollars, and a handwritten address from Leonard. Catherine explained this was the result of Leonard's investigation into Victor's biological family. It turned out that distant relatives from Victor's real mother were still alive and living there. She gave him these things not as an invitation to return, but as provisions to leave. Catherine looked straight into Victor's eyes. She said Victor could never be a good father if he himself had not healed. He was a man who had lost his identity, a lifelong victim of manipulation with a wounded soul. If Victor forced himself into their child's life now, he would only pass down trauma and confusion to his son. Catherine asked Victor to go and find his true self, to heal his inner wounds, to learn how to stand on his own 2 feet without the shadow of the past. That ticket was Victor's ticket to freedom, a chance to begin a new life in a place where no one knew his family's dark history. This was Catherine's final act of compassion, not as a wife, but as a fellow human being who wished to see another human being saved from total destruction. Victor clutched the envelope tightly. He looked at the ticket, then at Catherine's face. He finally understood. Returning to Catherine's home was not the solution, because that home was no longer his. The solution was to rebuild himself somewhere new. With a shattered heart, but a slight sense of relief, now that he had direction, Victor nodded. He wiped his tears roughly and thanked Catherine sincerely from the depths of his soul. Before leaving, Victor asked for one small thing. He wanted to see his child's face just once from afar, to carry that image with him before leaving forever. Catherine nodded and allowed him to look through the glass window. Victor pressed his face against the glass, gazing at the tiny baby sleeping inside. Tears fell again, leaving misty traces on the glass. He whispered goodbye to his son, silently promising that one day, when he had become a whole and worthy man, he would return, not to claim anything, but simply to greet him with his head held high. After that, Victor turned and walked away, leaving Catherine's yard with heavy yet steady steps, carrying his regrets toward a new horizon across the ocean. 6 months later, in a damp and grim women's prison complex on the outskirts of the city, the tall, dull concrete walls stood as silent witnesses to the collapse of arrogance. Inside a stifling isolation cell, an elderly woman with disheveled white hair sat curled up in a corner. It was Mrs. Reynolds. Her appearance was now worlds apart from the arrogant socialite who once draped herself in silk and diamonds. Her body was gaunt, her skin dull and blotched, her eyes hollow and vacant as they stared at the cold stone wall. The faded blue prison uniform hanging loosely on her frame became the ultimate symbol of her absolute downfall. Karma had worked with brutal precision. After being found guilty of a series of serious crimes, including child abduction, identity fraud, corporate embezzlement, and attempted inheritance fraud, Mrs. Reynolds was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But prison was not her greatest punishment. Her greatest torment was losing everything she had worshipped as her god: wealth and social status. All assets she once claimed as hers were confiscated by the state and returned to the rightful heir, Catherine's child. Her luxury mansion was seized, her jewelry collection auctioned off. Her former socialite friends vanished, pretending they had never known her. She was truly alone, bankrupt, disgraced. Mrs. Reynolds' mental condition began to deteriorate by the 2nd month of her incarceration. She frequently hallucinated. Every time the cell door made a sound, she would jump up and run to the bars screaming Victor's name, calling out to the son, who was never truly hers. She was convinced her son would come, bringing a brilliant lawyer and ransom money to free her. She would scream orders at the prison guards, treating them as if they were servants from her former mansion, demanding warm water for bathing or high-quality afternoon tea. But no one came. Victor had gone far overseas, cutting off all contact with her. The realization that the child she had stolen and raised as an investment for her old age had now abandoned her caused her sanity to slowly fracture. That afternoon, Mrs. Reynolds erupted again. She hurled her lunch tray, containing hard, stale rice, against the wall. She screamed hysterically, ranting about Mr. Reynolds' inheritance that she believed should have been hers. She cursed Catherine's name, calling her former daughter-in-law a thief and a witch. Other inmates in nearby cells shouted at her to shut up. Some even threw trash at her, fed up with the noise. Mrs. Reynolds, the woman who once refused to step on muddy ground, now slept on a cold concrete floor with only a thin mat beneath her, surrounded by cockroaches and the stench of urine. She cried and wailed, striking her own head, trapped in the hell she had created through her own greed. She was alive, but her soul was dead, drowned in endless regret and madness. There is no karma more painful than being left alone with evil thoughts that slowly devour their owner. In stark contrast to the darkness of the prison, light enveloped Catherine's life. On the top floor of a modern office building in downtown Chicago, Catherine stood on a wide balcony, gazing at the golden hues of the late afternoon sky. A gentle breeze played with the edge of her pastel-colored shawl. She was no longer just a mother. She was now a respected young commissioner. Together with Leonard and a team of professional managers, Catherine successfully restored the businesses left behind by her late father-in-law. The Reynolds family's plantation and property companies were once again healthy, expanding into social and educational initiatives in accordance with Mr. Reynolds' final wishes so that his wealth could benefit others. Catherine held her son in her arms. Arca, now 7 months old, had begun babbling actively. He was growing healthy and bright, carrying his father's eyes but his mother's smile. Catherine kissed Arca's cheek with deep affection. Her mind drifted back to the moment she had been thrown out through the gates, mocked as infertile. The pain still left a mark, but it no longer hurt. That pain had become her badge of courage. She had proven that 2 oppressed souls could become the most powerful force. She didn't need revenge with dirty hands. She didn't need to curse back or hire thugs. She simply needed to survive, protect the trust growing in her womb, and allow God to write a just ending. The balcony's glass door slid open. Leonard stepped out, carrying 2 cups of warm tea. He smiled gently, a smile that had strengthened Catherine through her hardest days. He stood beside her, sharing the city view. Their relationship had grown closer, not merely lawyer and client, but 2 trusted companions who relied on each other. There had been no talk of romance. Catherine still wanted to focus on Arca and her own healing. Yet Leonard's steady presence offered hope that someday there might be room for a new kind of love, healthy, equal, and respectful. Leonard never pushed. He waited patiently, just as he had waited patiently, passing through the storm with Catherine. Catherine sipped her tea, feeling warmth spread through her body. She felt truly free. Free from financial fear, free from her mother-in-law's intimidation, free from an unhappy marriage. Her thoughts briefly turned to Victor, who was likely struggling to rebuild his life on another continent. From afar, Catherine prayed for his well-being. She no longer hated him. Hatred would only poison her and bind her to the past. By letting Victor go and forgiving him, Catherine broke the chain of toxic karma. She didn't want Arca to grow up carrying her mother's resentment. Arca would grow up hearing that his father had gone far away to become a better man, and that his mother was a strong woman who fought fiercely for him. Catherine gazed at the sky as it shifted into deep shades of orange and red. She knew life's trials might come again in the future, but she was no longer afraid. She looked down at the busy streets below, then back at her son's face. She whispered softly to Arka, a promise for the future. She vowed to raise him into a man who respected women, who dared to speak up for truth, and who was never blinded by wealth. She was determined to end the toxic Reynolds family cycle with Arka's generation. This story did not end with a cliché romantic scene or mere material victory, but with inner peace. Catherine's true victory was her ability to remain a good person even after the world had treated her with cruelty. As the sun set completely, closing the day in beauty, Catherine smiled broadly. She had survived the darkest night of her life, and now the dawn of happiness rose brightly, illuminating her path, her child's path, and their hopeful future. In the distance, the bells of justice had stopped ringing, leaving behind the quiet echo of certainty that every good and evil deed will always find its way home.